But first up, you have to eat your vegetables and get what's good for you, because you're only going to get it on this show, guys, because everyone else is in Riot's pocket and can't say shit without losing their co-streaming privileges or what have you, without jeopardizing their careers with Riot. But we make a living off of criticizing Riot, so here you go. The one place.
I saw an article today that would blow your mind. It was like basically a puff piece some guy had written. I'm not sure what the publication was, and the title of the piece was how Jackie Felling, the new LCS commissioner, had something like increased fan interest in the LCS. So first of all, by the way, that would be quantifiable. You'd be able to know that. Secondly, the league's dying, by the way. The league is literally dying. So even if you think she's a good commissioner, I would say we're probably going to talk about some things that would suggest not doing the commissioner's job. The idea, what sort of mad puff piece is that, mate? We just had a discussion a few episodes ago. We don't think Monte casting Worlds changes the viewership. You think having a commissioner makes me you know what? I think I am interested in this LCS thing you're talking about. I've heard that commissioner straight. What are you talking about? Why are we writing these articles? These are just silly.
So I think that there are a few issues with this. So we've discussed this before, but even if she was the greatest commissioner of all time, in an actual league, the commissioner would be the top authority and have power. Instead, there are a bunch of people above her, lots of people, who are going to have the final say on things and not her. So she has bosses who then also have bosses who all work for esports at Riot Games. So the title itself is deceptive if you're considering... I think
it's just spokesperson, Monte, if I had to rename it.
No, I'm sure she does a lot. And honestly, a lot of what has changed, the production quality is way better this year than it has been. Look, I liked them bringing back the players at the finals. I think they did a really good job, and we'll talk about that. But the issue is that there's only so much you can do because of the hierarchy of Riot. And also, I think one of the things that we need to discuss, and this may not be entirely her fault, because the rules for LCS may have been set before she took over this position, and we'll see what they do in terms of changes. But the vegetables that you guys got to eat is an actual honest conversation about this Danny substitution, because this has been an issue that I think is fraught with a lot of difficulties. And
it's what you call a third rail topic, Monte.
Yeah.
You know, the third rail is the electrified one on the train tracks. So if you just touch it, you die, don't you? You get electrocuted. So the premise comes, right? It's not even that you have to have the wrong opinion to get in trouble. If you say anything that the zealots don't like, you automatically, if you're not on their side, you're against them. Even though it's a ridiculous spectrum to have. So essentially, if you criticize anything tangential to this story, they will imply you are actually saying mental health doesn't exist, isn't a problem, and that he doesn't have any issues whatsoever. Even though you'll find out we'll never say that on this episode. I did a video, never said that. In fact, I'll quickly put out there my general position, because it's actually what I've learned from CSGO. Because in CSGO, by the way, we've had a lot of these situations a la Danny and Double if happen. We have had flushes. I think it was his mum died. Right? No, Flush had died. His mum literally died right before a tournament. I think Dupree's father died before he won. I think Katowice, the third major or something. We've had a bunch of scenarios like this happen. Electronic had a child but still played the next tournament. What I always say is this, because actually, this is the key thing. It's not about the ruling and what the team does, because as an individual, I can't know their mind state. I cannot know what experiences they have had. I don't think it's actually possible for me to judge. Should they play? Is it? But I can't know. It's such that's essentially why I think it's hard to make rules like this. It's essentially just a completely different realm I can't access. So what I do is I do the opposite. I don't say you should have played. I say if you are Double Lift and you play, or Flush, or if you can actually then, or Dupree, if you play it and then you win, you're a hero. I'll just say that. I'll give you mad praise for doing it, because I can imagine there are circumstances that would essentially limit you and mean you couldn't play. So if someone comes through it, great, awesome job. But that's the problem I get with this, by the way. Even that is almost fraught with danger saying that, because then people are going to go, so you're implying the other guy isn't a hero. It's actually, that's something I want to say. I saw people go too far the other way. I'm willing to create this area of uncertainty where we just can't know. And essentially, it's up to the team if they have subs to replay. That's on them. But for the player, if he chooses, I can't play, that's something, by the way, the team has to choose if they agree, etc. But assuming they do, he goes out and he's substituted out. He doesn't play, right? But in this kind of scenario, I saw people doing this, dude. You know what? So courageous to take a game out, though. And it's actually so brave. You're not now a hero, Because essentially, in this case, what you're actually claiming, by the way, is a kind of injury. You're saying basically, and this could be mental, could be psychological, could, by the way, I don't even know, could be something happened in his life, could be something that happened to some family member of his that's affected him. Because something terrible happened to you. Actually, you know what? We're going to reframe that as the heroic thing is just to have it happen to you. Like, that's weird, because I think that almost encourages like a world where essentially, like I say, it almost encourages like people. I think essentially they're going to actually one day paint the guy who does go through all that and play it. It'll be like the fat shaming thing. You know, the way they don't do it, right? It's like, oh, stop saying people are fat. No, they get the person who loses weight and is really thin and looks awesome and go, you fat shame by existing. Like, I don't want to go to that world where like we're just messing up. So let's create a reasonable space where you don't have to criticize someone, you don't have to get in their arse about well, tell me exactly how you feel and all that. Like, we don't need to know those details. My whole topic on this, by the way, was never about Danny. The video was about Danny. My topic is about the second, third order effects and how other parties treat us. That's the topic we're going to talk about here. We're not going to speculate on anyone's mental health.
Yeah. And the thing is like, I would tell you guys if I knew what was happening with Danny. I wouldn't tell you what it was, but I would say, hey, I know, so I think this is my opinion based on the information that I have, which could be like, oh, it was totally justified, or I think this is ridiculous, or somewhere in between those things. But I'm just going to tell you straight up, I don't know. So I have to operate just with theoreticals, and then I have to say what I think the effects of this are going to be, because I don't think it's great for competitive integrity. I don't think it's great for precedent, although I also believe that they will change the rules. There's also some fuckery going on from EG that has never been discussed. So basically what happened, guys...
Yeah, go on.
...is that you are supposed to have, for playoffs, you're supposed to designate 2 substitute players, okay? And the reason behind this is that in the regular season, you do not need to designate them because you can move players between Academy and the LCS team.
You have 5 players. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, clearly they want to limit that for the playoffs. Although, to be fair to the situation, I actually don't know why you need to limit that in the playoffs. Like, if you want to sub your Academy players in your fucking LCS playoffs, I say let you do it.
Here's the thing, Monty. I'll give you the counter. The counter is, I'm Steve Arhanset. I'm never going to let this happen to me again. So you know what? Hansama, you're out. Turns out I actually had like Kobe on my bench and he can just play. He's in. That's the problem. Someone could have used the Academy angle just for this, right? Still, obviously not that likely, but I agree. You have to, at some point, by the way, spoiler, there are no good decisions in these scenarios with subs, because technically you shouldn't be allowed one. But one thing that I do think was mad that you're setting up to is, dude, it's not the case that like EG's at fault for what's happened to Danny. They're not necessarily at fault for taking him out and agreeing he shouldn't play. They're not at fault maybe even for wanting the Cowrie guy to play once this situation has happened. But I found it really distasteful, the idea nobody brought up and nobody criticised them for trying to essentially exploit the substitute rules, as far as I can tell, to just have an extra coach in the room. And by the way, when your team is the God coaching staff, mate, you can't have your cake and eat it. Well,
it's...
You know, but, no, that actually doesn't mean that. As I'll tell people again, having your cake and eating it means you eat it and then you think you still have it. You haven't. You've eaten it, haven't you? So, no, the premise of that scenario is you chose what you wanted. You wanted an overpowered coach and staff. Well, guess what? Now you've only got a jungle. And the other maddest detail of all, a lot of people won't know, I looked it up. The actual guy who was a coach used to be a player. He also plays jungle. Give me a break. Because, you know, they were going, well, what could they do, Monty? They needed an ADC. Well... Give me a break.
It's even worse than that, Thorin. I don't think it was for having another person in the room. I think they can have more coaches in the room. The thing about it is that Riot will only pay for transportation and hotel for a certain number of people, including the substitutes, if they go to Chicago. So usually what the teams do is that they'll put somebody into that substitute role, often a coach, so that they don't have to pay for travel and accommodation fees themselves, which obviously is ridiculous. It's just going to Chicago for a weekend. Okay.
Fair. So that is something that an evil genius would do, though. That's one angle I'll give him credit for. There we go. That's living up to the brand. Live evil.
So
exactly.
I don't know whether it was, as you say, they only had a certain number of people who could go into the room, and those included the
substitutes. That's just speculation.
But I do know that Riot pays for a certain number of people for travel and accommodation for the teams, and that it's possible that EG put this person on that so that they wouldn't have to pay cynically, even though they could obviously pay for a round-trip flight to Chicago and a hotel for 4 or 5 days. Point is like, EG didn't think this through, clearly. And, you know, they sent Cowrie back to Turkey or Europe, wherever he was, because they had to recall him at the last second and end up, you know, bringing him in. But the problem is that when it comes to competitive integrity, so also you say that EG isn't at fault. Technically, we don't know that EG wasn't at fault. EG may have created the problem which triggered Danny's mental health crisis. Like,
Yeah,
we don't
can't
know
know.
that.
Sure.
I mean, I can say that Danny didn't look great for the whole playoffs, and not only like in terms of his play, but in terms of his player cams, his reactions. He looked really off, before whatever last event in their victory caused him to kind of be pushed over the edge or what have you. But also because there's no information and this has been categorized as an emergency.
Yep.
I mean, how do you categorize a mental health emergency? Now, there may be something really serious that happened. That's true. That is, categorized. But if it's just,
it's worse than that, Monte. You say, how can you categorize? They say they verified it. I will say that is impossible. Now, listen, I'm not saying the entire field of like clinical psychology doesn't exist or anything. What I'm saying is this. Again, this is the problem again with this conversation. I'll reframe it. We're not talking about the Danny situation because we can't know that. What we're worried about in this scenario is you set a precedent and someone else, sinister, could decide, that's a loophole I could get through. And so even though everyone's going to go, it's so unlikely, mate. I'm in a game where CSGO is full of match fixes. I think the world champions in League of Legends match fixed a few years ago. Savior, Life, two of the greatest StarCraft players match fixed. People do Chinese betting rings, all that. The idea that it does, you can't just say it might happen. It does happen. It does happen. The question is, are you going to allow it to happen one time so that 9 people can get through and maybe be cool, or 90 people can get through? For me, the problem is the extreme violations, what you could get from that, as in this scenario, could have even made an example. Like the joke is, if I really did have double lift on my bench, I'd be better in this match, wouldn't I? I might win. So you don't want someone to do a cynical 2-man lineup like that. You don't want someone to lie about this. So one thing I noticed that I thought really was wild was in the statement. That's why I alluded to the fact I don't think she did a good job as a commissioner, because there was no public thing. There was no. It wasn't even posted on LoL Esports. Jat happened to just reference it in an article. That's it. It was never put. By the way, if you went to LoL Esports, you'd never know Danny wasn't there. They've already banged on about him the whole fucking year, but you'd never know he wasn't going to be in the finals. You'd be like, oh, brilliant, evil geniuses. So they never put like a news post, as far as I can tell. And then the reason why, spoiler, it's obvious, because in a formal post you'd have to do the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why, and where. This is ridiculous. So instead what they did is Jackie Felling went on Reddit, so she's actually at Lena's status now. She went to Reddit and replied to it, not even made her own thread, replied to a fan. That's it. And then on Twitter she sort of said something tangential, which was basically more just like, I've had problems myself with, mental health, and I've suffered, which is like just to say that you empathise essentially. But what I couldn't stand about the way it was written, Monty, was it was written so informal. It wasn't written like a professional statement. And as a result, for example, she never addressed what they'd done with their 2 subs and the fact that one of them wasn't even really an eligible player. That was never mentioned. Instead, what you did is this. You made people feel really sorry because someone might be going through a really suffering, tough time, right? And you played on that to imply we have to just give them everything and throw the rule book out, right? Which is like, that will never make sense, by the way. That angle will never make sense. There's no sport in the world where you can just strip away the rules because someone has a hard time. There's tragedy befalls all of us. The reason it's called integrity is it holds together. It's something that remains stable. It can't be going willy-nilly over. Because here's the thing I would ask, dude. What if there was another player in the LCS, and they didn't know this, by the way, Monty, and he himself was having a really hard time? Like, maybe his game went to shit in the playoffs. Maybe he was feeling like he let the team down. His team was supposed to win. This has happened many times in LCS, by the way. And behind the scenes, maybe he's actually having sort of like a really hard time, and he's breaking down, but he's thinking to himself, I can't sit out. My team's got top and jungle as their sub positions, and I'm, let's say, support. How can I sit out and let the whole team down? But it turns out if he'd have actually just said, I have these problems, they'd have created a whole new rule. See what I mean? That's why it's not integrity. What about all the other people? They never got a chance to do this. Plus, that's my problem with it.
I was saying his champion pool had issues. He wasn't performing well. His laning was quite bad.
Yep.
And so the problem is they actually upgraded their AD carry, at least in the current meta and at the current time.
And in the games, if you just watch them.
For Danny, now the inability to play the champion pool, his kind of regression, because he used to, coming into MSI, he was having a lot of these problems, and then it looked like his laning had gotten better, but then it kind of regressed during playoffs again. And so the problem is like, it could be tied to this mental health issue, like why his performance is this way for sure. But the problem is like you can have an emergency substitute of a player who's better. And this just incentivizes teams basically to potentially create artificial mental health crises. Again, I'm not accusing EG or Danny of doing this.
We're talking about the future team that exploits this.
Yes, exactly. And I think that it sets a really bad precedent because it's not like a big conspiracy to say this because it's pretty easy for a coach or a manager to say, hey, you look really stressed right now. Spoiler, guys. They're fucking professional players. They are always mentally
stressed. It's an occupational hazard, obviously.
Every fucking one of them is always going fucking crazy half the time.
Even the ones that win.
Yeah, these are people, guys, who have such an insane level of drive that they want to play one video game 14 hours a day for years just for the chance to compete at the top level. And then if they perform badly, they get shit on social media as if they're complete losers who have no work ethic. So, it's not low stress. So the point is like, if there is no verification of what a mental health crisis is amongst a career and professional class of people who are always under extreme pressure, to keep their jobs, from the fans, from public exposure, from the nature of competition, then it's like getting a medical marijuana.
That was literally the analogy I gave in my video.
Really? So I just came up with that right now.
No, what I said was basically, if you don't know, back in the day, because the doctors used to A, be doctors who liked weed and wanted to spread the message, and B, they knew they got money for selling the card. The joke was whatever symptoms you said, they would say, so I have problems sleeping, I've got something for that. Oh, I've got like tension in my legs, got something for that. I'm a bit stressed about everything. Oh, stress, got some. Like the joke was whatever you said, they were, here's the weed card. And so you were going to get it no matter what. It became an industry, didn't it? By the way, one thing I'll even say very briefly, I'm not even an expert about League of Legends, Monty. Normally I say I leave draft out of it. Mate, I just went before this game and I looked it up, right? The champions they play and what they've been playing. Do you know what made me the most sick? This actually really turned my stomach because I worried that actually EG would win and it would violate the whole competitive integrity of the tournament. When I looked, the only 2 ADCs in the whole tournament who actually do play the whole European and Eastern meta were FBI and were Berserker. And so what you did to 100 Thieves and Cloud9, if they'd have had to play Cloud9 as well, is you said, that enormous draft gap you've got by having one of the best players at this position who has insane value. Because by the way, if basically even FBI wasn't playing that great, he has all the champions as well. He plays them all. You just said, right, fuck your draft gap. You don't get a draft gap because somehow your sub is the 3rd ADC in the league now that has all that. But it would have been an enormous gap if you watched what happened before, whether he's up or down. Like Danny, if you don't know, basically, if you banned Zeri, he had to go to things like Seraphine or play like a bad game of Sivir. Like that's an example where luckily 100 Thieves won. So in my opinion, it sort of ended well for everyone, and we didn't have to get upset about it. But mate, I remember watching those games and being like, bloody hell, this might just be EG winning. And basically, you can't say it wouldn't be because they got this specific player who wasn't their sub. I think that would have been a travesty if it happened, personally.
Yeah, I think hopefully the substitution rules will be revisited and that there won't be room to pull the emergency card on this kind of stuff. Because again, I don't really see that big of an issue because teams are unlikely to have academy teams that are paying like tier 1 players.
Yes.
So I think it's unlikely to be an issue. I could be wrong about that, but I do disagree. And
it's also very rare, let's be real, that like a top team that could afford it, like let's say Team Liquid, even if it is Hansama, it's still unlikely if they have Wild Turtle on the bench that they're really going to sub him in. Like they probably just stick with Hansama. So we'll see. It's obviously fairly unlikely.
I also just don't understand the purpose behind allowing this emergency substitute. And the reason why I say that is because if, as somebody who has been commissioner for several years, my ruling in this situation would be, here are your subs, use one of your subs, because you have to look at the stakes. The stakes were what? They already made worlds, okay? Yep. So you're not deciding a world slot with this. So really what you're saying is we're going to play a shitty best of 5 on the first day of the finals weekend in Chicago, and that may hurt some of our attendance or viewership. But at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do with the rules that were set out in terms of competitive integrity. And I would have just left it at that, because if there had been a world slot on the line, I may have allowed some kind of emergency substitution just to have I don't want to send, the wrong team to worlds, as it were. But for this event, what effectively was EG being a pretty big underdog, and then also the fact that it can be abused, because in this situation, as we discussed on Competitive Edge earlier this week, it appeared and indeed was an upgrade over Danny based on his current performance. So with all of that information, I think you make a different decision.
On the topic of that, though, making the decision, let's get into that, though, Monte, because there's another thing. I found this part of the Jackie Filling Reddit statement to be absurd, where she actually tried to conflate, Monte, not telling you the details of Danny's mental health condition with not explaining why they made the decision. That's mental. No, I'm sorry. When you make that decision, you go in front of the press like Dana White would, and you go, questions, please. And then they ask you, like, this decision's been made. Obviously, it's not in the rule book. So how did you change it? Because, by the way, when I looked up, I'm almost certain this rule was in a different section. It was actually intended for the regular season. But okay, when you do all this, you would have to answer the hard questions, and you would have to dance your way around them, and you'd have to say how much you can say without saying too much. And what you didn't have to do any of that. Instead, what you implied was like, Riot is a black box. Just trust that the man behind the curtain is not doing anything, and the Wizard of Oz will solve all your problems. Like, that's nonsense. Because at that point in time, why even have rules if they're just some god fun in it? If it's like just fucking like Warhammer 40k and they're just psychos are just contacting the fucking then just have the God Emperor choose it all. Make Jackie Filling the God Emperor, and she just chooses her win what you do, because that's the reason. The reason they have to have a reason what you is that's what the precedent will be based on. That's what it will. You know.
Yeah, I have a checkmate for you, Thorin, on this one when it comes to Riot. So in the spring of 2018, Team Liquid was playing in the finals, right? And we talked about Doublelift's unfortunate situation earlier. Now, if Riot was a compassionate company that wanted to hide some of the mental health issues that were being potentially suffered by these players. So there was no hiding. This is, of course, when Doublelift's mom was really tragically killed by his brother. Now, there was no hiding that, because that was just publicly available.
It's in the news and everything,
based on a murder. So, yeah, they couldn't suppress the actual news off of that, right? And obviously was, I personally thought Doublelift was going to play that final just because I know him and who he is.
Exactly.
But I totally would have understood if he didn't play that final. Those are obviously extraordinary circumstances.
And by the way, Doublelift is not a normal guy. That's also why. Like, Doublelift is a guy with the insane drive. He's just a guy where I agree, Monty. To me, Doublelift's career in life, whether he agrees now, his purpose was at one point in time, League of Legends, be the best he could be.
Yep.
And by the way, if you know his career, of course he wants to stack championships. He's been through the hard times where you get nothing. So yeah, I thought the same thing, mate.
But here's the checkmate, Thorin. If you are so concerned with preserving the mental health of your players, so there was a Netflix documentary that you guys can go watch, which is called 7 Days Out, it's a series that looks at big events that happen around the world. So in sports or concerts or these other things, that shows kind of the process of getting ready for these events, right? And they did one that year at that spring finals on the LCS, okay? And they had Doublelift mic'd on a lav mic under his shirt on a conversation he had with, I think it was the hospital or the police about that incident. And then they put it on Netflix. So if you're concerned with the personal welfare of these players and of their mental health,
it's a bit ghoulish, isn't it?
They literally have Doublelift mic'd on a phone talking about this incident with the authorities.
Essentially, if you don't get the premise, not only is that ghoulish, but they're actively exploiting it for fame and clicks or money.
For the Netflix show.
Yeah, it's wild. Like, oh, by the way, another thing I want to say.
If you really care about player mental health, like, what the fuck, Riot? Like, you can't oscillate between these ridiculous extremes all the time. Now, it's possible Doublelift gave permission for that to be used.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't.
It's the framing, like you say. Yeah,
use it.
Yeah. Even if he says yes, why is that relevant? Yeah, exactly. Because here's the thing. What's funny is all roads lead to Doublelift, because it's the fucking LCS, isn't it? Spoiler bukes, and you don't really pick up those championships without Doublelift, do you? I just had to get that one in there. Jensen. No, whatever. No, here's the other point I was going to make. There's also exactly another fucking reference for Doublelift, isn't there? Because, mate, I didn't go as hard as this at the time myself. Because you know what? I've made this point many times. Things like legal statuses, rules, and the reason why, if you're a fan and you wade in there with a strong opinion without knowing, you'll be a fool. It's because they're really complicated. And not only that, you have to know them as an abstract, like this is the principle, and then you have to know, like, well, how is it applied? And then you have those famous things. There's the letter of the law, there's the spirit of the law. By the way, I would say the spirit of the law, in the case of a rule for substitution, is not that you could possibly upgrade your team strategy and player and get a better chance to win. That basically is exactly not what an emergency sub rule would be to enable in theory. But okay, difficult circumstances, it was a rookie, and that probably made it more unique. If people don't know, in 2017, if you remember, Doublelift had been in TSM now for 2 splits he'd played in season 6. They lost to CLG in that first split where he had a yellow star. Then they had that really super dominant best of 3 season, if you remember, where they lost the 1 series ever, and then they just won everything, and they won the championship. They went to Worlds and had like the failure, but the one where like they could have done pretty well, and they were in that super hard group. The next year, if you remember, Doublelift classically took the spring split off. Not like in Team Liquid where he just played shit. He actually didn't play at all. He became a streamer, and at the time, his whole thing was sort of like, I'll come back in summer, because supposedly at World and Green had like worked them all to death in the summer the previous one, and they felt burned out after Worlds. So famously what happened was TSM didn't need him. They actually played Wild Turtle, they played to topside with Hotzer, and they just won the league again. And here's what's hilarious. You're going to love this, Monty, because I actually had sources in TSM, very big sources at the time. Not only did they give me the story, we're going to, by the way, because at the time it was quid pro quo. By the way, Thorin, we're going to send Doublelift to Team Liquid. And I remember being like, what the fuck are you talking about? And then basically, it was even intimated to me by a certain source, like, I'm also going to do this because he thinks he should be the starter, no questions in summer. But since Wild Turtle just won, I think maybe we should make him compete for the spot. So the whole thing of Doublelift was sort of like, can I go and play in Team Liquid? Obviously going to go like, watch this motherfucker. You need me in TSM. So there was all this drama behind it, right? And basically what happened was Team Liquid was going to go into relegations and probably get kicked out of the league. They were a fucking terrible team. If you remember, season 7, this is after all the Breaking Point, Dardoch drama, Piglet drama. The team was an absolute mess. Those rookies were falling apart, and they were going to absolutely probably flush out of the LCS. But all of a sudden, TSM, the best team in the whole league, is able to lend a former MVP, by the way, a guy stacking championships for them, to their rival Team Liquid to keep them in the LCS. And if people don't know, this is the part that we didn't look into, because at the time people just said, oh, interesting move. What we didn't look into is, how could that be in the rules? Essentially, if you don't get it, guys, that would be like, because in football, obviously in the Premier League, you have relegation, right? Imagine if like the top team, so Man City, by the way, won the league. Imagine they have loads of mega players on the bench. Imagine if they could just lend like a world-class player to the bottom team and go, you can just stay in because you're my friend. Oh, the other teams at the bottom, fuck you. And then imagine the league goes, I'm going to allow this. You'd be like, what? You can't send like MVPs over. And the whole premise there was, again, it all rested on that fucking wording. It was like, it will be at Riot's discretion and the judgment that they will make. And as I say, you've just made them a god emperor then. And unfortunately, if I have to tell you one thing about the history of Riot decision making, it is not only incredibly capricious when viewed at a large lens, but when viewed in minutiae, it clearly is biased towards certain people. Like, there's a reason why back in the day, Richard used to have that line. He called them the 3 kings. It was Reggie, it was Jack, and it was Steve, because they were like the 3 kings of the LCS. Whatever they wanted to do somehow just happened. Visa things, subs, whatever's good. Like, somehow every single rule just bent to their will. Meanwhile, you know this very well. If you were a smaller team, if you were a Renegades or maybe a Gravity, so mate, you just get bent over by the rules. In fact, you'll be fucked by the rules they make for them. And that was always the vibe. Because if you don't get it, there wasn't
retroactively fucked.
Yeah,
they
exactly.
made new rules and then retroactively applied them,
which also can't have happened, by the way. Like, well, the whole point, there wasn't franchising yet, but let's be real. Riot already understood, even without franchising, if you have any of these teams, Team Liquid, Cloud9 and TSM leave the league, whoever comes can't bring the same fan base, can't bring the same viewership, won't even have the same players, won't even have the money, by the way, to buy these players. They'd just be better than the 10th best or 8th best team. And so the implication of what Riot's decision was, it wasn't just like, we love Team Liquid. It was like, we're just going to keep a big team in the league, the rich get richer and the poor get fucked. That was kind of the vibe. And I have to say, when I look back now, that should have been a way bigger deal. That was actually a fucking travesty. And even worse, he went back to TSM and won the next bloody split. That is so fucking mental. I can almost not process it when I think that. I can't believe, because at the time, here's the sad thing, I was the fan back then. I was like, but I like Doublelift. I hope Dardoch does. You know what I mean? Like, I was the fan back then. Fucking hell. We were all plebs once, guys. We were all plebs.
I think, it was outrageous just to save Team Liquid from relegation. I mean, they could have made it back in. They could have been...
Also, spoiler, a few years later, Doublelift... In fact, the next year, Doublelift went to Team Liquid and won the championship in a super team. Mate, Bill Belichick right now is applying to join the LCS. He's like, I don't know anything about League of Legends, but fucking brilliant. The coaches rigged the whole league. You know, they punish me for rigging the league. It's not a bad joke if you know the reference. Go on.
I mean, and to be fair, like, a lot of the LCS leadership has changed pretty dramatically during these periods. But the problem is that they never actually had an ethical core to begin with. Look, I welcome the new era of ethical LCS if it happens, but this isn't
happen because they keep doing this, Monte. Okay, yeah, we agree. We made a mistake. So starting now, well, after that, now, right, whatever, in season 13. Like, God, it has to start eventually. By the way, dude, I always think this as well. How wild is it that League of Legends is in season 13? That's wild in itself. I never thought it would last this long. You know, it could have been a flash in the pan game, 4 or 5. It could be like StarCraft 2. But what's more wild is, bro, like, fuck all's changed. They've had such minor steps. And they've just, if people don't know, they've been like farming Brinks trucks of $1 billion into a fucking Scrooge McDuck vault in China somewhere. And they're not, we can't just change the rules. Like, come on, man.
And then also, you know, once it goes into the 10-cent vault, then the Chinese government is just like dipping their hands in there to, you know, pay for those Uyghur detention facilities.
Yeah, they're just like, of course. They're like, yes, we thank you, Riot and Frostgorin. What you have made us will be very well used. Send out the next Riot tanks. I mean, the irony of it being called Riot, I could never get over it itself. I know, fucking hell. That's really aged badly, guys. Really aged really badly. Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, you know, be a pleb and don't.